The sea foam cut through the sapphire waters of the Solent with a precision that made the watching crowds fall silent, and Beatrice Wentworth felt the familiar surge of pure joy that came only when wind and water and human skill aligned in perfect harmony. Her hands were steady on the lines despite the salt spray that stung her eyes and the weight of the borrowed trousers that hung loose on her frame, the cap pulled low over her distinctive auburn hair, now dark with sea water and sweat. Ahead by 3 boat lengths, Lord Edmund Tilney's yacht Valiant held the inside position, the Earl's golden hair visible even from this distance, as he barked orders to his crew with the confidence of a man who had won the Regatta Cup 3 years running and expected nothing less than a 4th victory. The July sun blazed overhead, turning the white sails of hundreds of spectator vessels into a forest of brilliant canvas, and the royal pavilion on the shore gleamed with bunting and flags, while brass bands played victory marches premature in their certainty. Beatrice's father sat huddled near the mast, his breathing laboured, consumption having stolen the strength that once made Captain Josiah Wentworth a legend in naval circles. But his eyes burned with fierce pride as he watched his daughter do what he could no longer manage himself. The final mark loomed ahead, a boy bobbing in the whitecaps, and Beatrice saw what Tilney in his arrogance could not, the subtle shift in wind direction that came when coastal currents met open water, the way the pennant on the committee boat suddenly snapped northeast instead of east. She had studied these waters since childhood, had sailed them in every season and weather, had learned to read the sea the way other women read novels, and she knew with absolute certainty that the wind would shift again in precisely 40 seconds. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she made her decision, calling out orders that sent the sea foam into a tack that appeared suicidal, cutting inside Tilney's position at an angle that brought gasps from the watching crowds who thought she would surely collide or lose her wind entirely. The Earl's face went purple with rage as he realized her intention, and he shouted commands to block her, but Beatrice had already committed to the maneuver, her hands moving with the unconscious grace of 20 years' practice as she adjusted sail trim and shifted her weight to compensate for the heel. The wind came exactly when she knew it would, filling the sea foam's canvas with a crack like a gunshot, and suddenly they were flying, the yacht responding to her touch like a living thing as they shot past Valiant's stern with inches to spare. Tilney's curses carried across the water, but Beatrice had no attention for anything except the finish line, the tiller alive in her hand, the boat perfectly balanced, every sense attuned to the subtle messages of wind and wave. They crossed the line 3 seconds ahead of Valiant, and the roar from the spectator boats was deafening, a wall of sound that crashed over Beatrice like a physical force as she finally allowed herself to breathe, to feel the triumph coursing through her veins, hot and sweet and absolutely earned. Her cap flew off in that moment of victory, caught by a gust of wind, and her auburn hair tumbled free in a cascade that caught the sunlight, and the roar of celebration transformed in an instant to a susurrus of shock that rippled through the assembled crowds like wind through grass. In the sudden terrible silence that followed, Beatrice stood tall on the deck of the sea foam, her chin raised and her grey-green eyes the colour of a storm-tossed sea, blazing with defiance, even as her hands began to tremble with the first cold touch of understanding. Lord Tilney's yacht drew alongside, and the Earl's handsome face was contorted with an outrage that might have been comical if it were not so venomous, his athletic frame rigid with affronted masculine pride as he pointed an accusing finger across the water. The committee boat approached with flags flying, and Chairman Whitmore stood at the bow with an expression of scandalized horror, his portly frame quivering with indignation as he surveyed the scene before him. Beatrice's father tried to stand, tried to speak in her defense, but consumption had stolen his voice along with his strength, and he collapsed into a coughing fit that sprayed blood onto the deck, and Beatrice moved to support him even as her heart sank with the knowledge of what was coming. Lord Tilney's voice carried across the water with the clarity of long practice at command, each word chosen to wound and diminish. "The committee will of course disqualify this absurdity," he announced to the assembled crowds, his tone dripping with contempt. "Women crewing racing vessels? What's next? Letting them vote?" The laughter that followed was ugly, the mirth of men whose certainties had been threatened and who sought refuge in mockery, and Beatrice felt each laugh like a physical blow, even as she kept her expression carefully neutral. "My father holds the legal entry, Lord Tilney," she called back, her voice carrying despite the tremor she could not quite suppress. "I merely crewed his vessel, which the rules permit for family members. Or do you fear that precedent, because your own sons might prove as incompetent as their father when faced with real competition?" The gasps at her audacity were gratifying for perhaps 3 seconds before Chairman Whitmore's pronouncement fell like an executioner's blade. "Miss Wentworth," he intoned with the gravity of a judge passing sentence, "your presence on that vessel has brought disgrace to this noble sport. The victory is awarded to Lord Tilney, and you and your father are banned from future regattas." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Beatrice felt the injustice of it burning in her throat, choking her more effectively than any hand around her neck. In the royal pavilion, standing apart from the laughing crowds, Sebastian Fairfax lowered his brass telescope slowly, his dark eyes thoughtful as they tracked the young woman who stood so defiantly on the deck of the Seafoam, despite the humiliation raining down upon her. "Extraordinary," he murmured to his companion, a statement rather than a question. "Did you see that final tack, Alistair? That was not luck. That was mastery." His companion, Lord Alistair Morland, shrugged with the indifference of a man who cared little for sailing and less for social controversy. "The committee seems ready to forget it entirely." "Your Grace," he observed, but Sebastian continued to watch through his telescope as Beatrice helped her father below decks, her movements gentle despite the rigid control in her spine, the way she held her head high even as the crowd's laughter followed her like a curse. The afternoon sun continued to blaze with indifferent brilliance, turning the Solent into a field of diamonds, and the brass bands struck up a triumphant march as Lord Tilney accepted the regatta cup with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and all around them England's elite sipped champagne and agreed that really the Wentworth girl had gotten exactly what she deserved for presuming to compete in a gentleman's sport. But Sebastian Fairfax stood silent and still, his telescope trained on the small yacht that was making its way slowly toward Portsmouth, and in his mind calculations were already forming, possibilities taking shape, a plan beginning to crystallize that would change not just one woman's life, but the course of English sailing itself. The wooden deck of the Seafoam became a stage of humiliation, surrounded by hundreds of boats filled with spectators who would dine out on this story for months, who would shake their heads over the scandal and tut about girls who didn't know their place, who would never understand that what they had witnessed was not disgrace, but excellence punished for the crime of existing in the wrong body. Beatrice sat below decks with her father's head in her lap, listening to his labored breathing and the distant sound of celebration from the shore. And she told herself that she would not cry, that she would not give them that satisfaction, even as something inside her chest cracked and bled in a way that had nothing to do with physical wounds. The salt spray on her face mingled with tears she would never acknowledge, and her grey-green eyes stared unseeing at the cabin wall while her mind replayed that perfect tack, that moment of absolute mastery, that victory that would be forever erased from the record books as though it had never happened at all. 3 weeks after the regatta, Beatrice Wentworth stood alone on the cold beach at Portsmouth and wondered if skill without opportunity was worse than having no skill at all, her words lost in the wind that whipped her cloak around her legs and stung her face with salt spray. What use is skill if the world will never permit you to exercise it? She whispered to the empty shore, her voice bitter with a resignation that had settled into her bones like winter damp. I might as well have been born without hands. The cottage she returned to each morning was modest, but filled with the remnants of her father's naval career, charts covering walls that had once been papered with flowers, a brass chronometer on the mantel that no longer kept time, coils of rope in corners, and the smell of canvas and tar that no amount of airing could quite dispel. Captain Josiah Wentworth lay in his bed most days now, the consumption that had been merely troublesome before the regatta having accelerated into something far more sinister, his coughing fits leaving bloody handkerchiefs that Beatrice washed in secret so he would not see the evidence of his own decline. They had sold his collection of naval instruments the week before, the sextants and telescopes and compasses that had guided him through decades of service now converted to coins that would pay the apothecary and the butcher and buy them perhaps another month before harder decisions had to be made. The gossip columns had been merciless in their coverage, each new edition bringing fresh humiliation. The sailing spinster, one had dubbed her, while another preferred the Wentworth embarrassment, and the articles that followed dissected every aspect of her character and her history with the gleeful cruelty of society protecting its boundaries. She was too old at 26, too mannish in her pursuits, too educated for a woman, and too unconventional for marriage, and the few acquaintances who had tolerated her eccentricity when her father still had connections now crossed the street rather than acknowledge her presence. Beatrice spent her days in a routine that felt like slow drowning, caring for her father through his worst hours, preparing meals from increasingly meager supplies, and taking long, solitary walks on the beach when the grey skies and cold wind matched the desolation in her heart. Only at dawn did she allow herself the one indulgence she could not surrender, sailing their small day boat Persephone alone when the world still slept and no one could witness her defiance of propriety, the tiller in her hand the only thing that made her feel remotely human. Her mother had died when Beatrice was 4, a memory so distant it felt more like a dream than reality, and Captain Wentworth had looked at his tiny daughter and made a decision that would shape both their lives. Having no sons, and refusing to believe that gender should determine capability, he had raised Beatrice as he would have raised a boy, teaching her navigation before she could read poetry, maritime law before she learned to dance, sailing before she mastered the pianoforte. She could calculate tides using lunar tables, read charts with the accuracy of any naval officer, splice rope in a dozen different configurations, and recite the tactical details of every major naval battle of the past century from Trafalgar to the Nile. This education, given with love and pride by a father who saw no limits to his daughter's potential, had made her unmarriageable in a society that valued ornamental accomplishment over practical skill. 3 London seasons had resulted in no offers, only a series of humiliating encounters with men who were either intimidated by her knowledge or dismissive of it as an aberration to be corrected through marriage. One particularly memorable suitor had informed her that no man wanted a wife who could navigate better than he could, while another had suggested that her maritime obsession was clearly compensation for the emptiness of her feminine nature. She had retreated to Portsmouth after the 3rd failed season, telling herself she preferred the honest company of boats to the dishonest company of drawing rooms, but the loneliness had settled into her like a physical ache that no amount of sailing could quite ease. Now, at 26 and notorious, she was convinced her life was effectively over, too old and too scandalous for marriage, with no acceptable outlet for the passion that burned in her chest whenever she felt wind in her face and a deck beneath her feet. The morning she returned from her dawn sail to find Portsmouth harbour transformed, Beatrice thought at first she was hallucinating from lack of sleep, or perhaps from the slow starvation of hope. Anchored in the harbour, magnificent and impossible, was a 3-masted schooner so newly built that its paint gleamed even in the weak morning light, its lines so perfect they made her throat tight with longing. The vessel flew no colours, bore no name she could see from shore, and sat in the water with the graceful poise of a thing built by masters who understood that ships were not merely wood and canvas, but living partnerships between human will and natural force. She was still staring when Mrs. Gardiner, their housekeeper, came running down the beach path with news that a naval courier had arrived with a letter for Captain Wentworth, and Beatrice's hands were shaking as she helped her father sit up to receive the sealed envelope. Inside was a deed of ownership, the legal language precise and official, transferring title of not just the schooner which bore the name the Meridian, but also two smaller racing yachts called Celestial and Windward, all three vessels registered in Beatrice's name, as though such a thing were perfectly ordinary rather than completely unprecedented. The letter was brief, signed simply with the initials SF, and its contents made Beatrice's heart hammer against her ribs with a hope she was afraid to acknowledge. Miss Wentworth, the letter read in a strong, angular hand, your skill deserves a proper fleet. These vessels require an experienced captain for their maiden voyages, and I should like to engage you as sailing master for my maritime investments. Please present yourself at Thornbury House in London at your earliest convenience to discuss terms. Captain Wentworth read the letter twice, his hands trembling with more than just illness, his expression cycling through confusion and recognition, and something that might have been cautious joy. SF, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Sebastian Fairfax, the Duke of Thornbury, good God. Beatrice felt the room tilt slightly, the impossibility of a duke sending ships to a disgraced spinster too enormous to process. Why would a duke send ships to a disgraced spinster he has never met? She asked, her voice carefully neutral even as her mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Her father looked at her with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty to be easily deceived by apparent generosity. Perhaps because he recognized that disgrace and merit are not always aligned, he said slowly. Sebastian Fairfax was a midshipman under Admiral Collingwood at Trafalgar, distinguished himself in action, became Duke unexpectedly when his two older brothers died in a carriage accident. He is known in naval circles as a man of unconventional opinions and considerable principle. Will you go to London? The question hung between them, weighted with all the complications of pride and desperation, hope and fear. Beatrice's first instinct was refusal, the certainty that this must be some elaborate joke, or worse, that no man gave ships to a woman without expecting something in return that she would never willingly give. But then she looked out the window at the Meridian, riding at anchor in Portsmouth harbour, the morning light turning its sails to gold, and she felt something crack in the careful numbness she had built around her heart. She walked to the harbour alone, leaving her father to rest, and the harbour-master let her take the small tender out to the schooner without question, perhaps because the deed in her pocket bore her name, or perhaps because her face carried the expression of a woman who would not be denied. Boarding the Meridian was like stepping into a dream, every detail perfect from the teak deck smooth as silk beneath her boots to the brass fittings that gleamed with fresh polish to the rigging that showed the work of masters who understood that lives depended on the strength of every knot. She ran her hands over the rails, touched the wheel with reverent fingers, examined the sail inventory, and found canvas of a quality she had only ever imagined. And with each discovery, the hope she had tried to suppress grew stronger and more painful. The finest vessel she had ever seen, built with care and skill and resources beyond anything she could have dreamed, and it bore her name on the deed, as though she had every right to captain such magnificence. The tears came then, not from sadness, but from being truly seen for the first time in her life, from the understanding that someone somewhere had witnessed her skill and thought it deserved not censure, but celebration, not punishment, but reward. She stood at the wheel of the Meridian with tears streaming down her face, and let herself feel the hope she had been afraid to acknowledge. The possibility that perhaps her life was not over after all, that perhaps the world was larger and stranger and more full of unexpected grace than she had dared to believe. When she returned to the cottage, her father was sitting up in bed with more animation than she had seen in weeks, and the question in his eyes was clear even before he spoke. "How can I not go?" she said, her voice steady despite the tumult in her chest. "Papa, someone has finally offered me the one thing I have always wanted, the chance to sail without apology." The decision made, Beatrice began preparations for the journey to London with a mixture of trepidation and fierce determination, packing her few respectable dresses and trying not to think too hard about what sort of man sent ships to strangers or what he might expect in return. The 3 vessels remained in Portsmouth harbour, the Meridian and Celestial, and Windward, floating like promises or perhaps like questions, their presence a constant reminder that somewhere in London a duke named Sebastian Fairfax had seen her race and reached a conclusion that no one else had reached, that her skill was worth investing in rather than suppressing. The contrast between the luxury of those ships and the working-class reality of Beatrice's reduced circumstances was stark, the gleaming paint and perfect rigging, a rebuke to the shabby cottage and empty cupboards, the possibility they represented almost painful in its brightness against the grey resignation of the past 3 weeks. Portsmouth harbour bustled with its usual traffic of naval vessels and merchant ships, sailors and dock workers going about their business with the casual competence of men who made their living from the sea, and none of them seemed to find it remarkable that 3 magnificent ships now sat at anchor with a woman's name on their deeds. On her last morning before leaving for London, Beatrice sailed Persephone one final time, watching the sun rise over water that had been her consolation and her prison, and she made herself a promise that whatever happened in London, whatever the Duke's true motives might be, she would not surrender the one thing that made her who she was. She would sail or she would drown, but she would not pretend to be less than she was ever again. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Beatrice arrived at Thornbury House in Mayfair wearing her best day dress, which was simple and practical and years out of fashion. The fabric faded from sun and salt air, her hands trembling slightly as she climbed the steps to a mansion so grand it made her cottage in Portsmouth look like a garden shed. She had left her father in the care of Mrs. Gardiner, with strict instructions about his medicines and meals, and the entire journey to London she had rehearsed this meeting in her mind, preparing herself for a lecherous old man who wanted her as a curiosity, or perhaps as something worse, or for a patronizing aristocrat who would treat her maritime skill as an amusing aberration to be displayed at dinner parties like a trained animal performing tricks. The butler who answered her knock looked at her worn dress with an expression that managed to convey both professional neutrality and subtle disdain. But he showed her inside without comment, leading her through corridors decorated with paintings worth more than she would earn in a lifetime, past drawing rooms filled with furniture so delicate it seemed designed to discourage actual use. She was prepared for ostentation, for the sort of masculine showmanship that proclaimed wealth and power through excess. But when the butler opened the library door, Beatrice stopped so abruptly she nearly stumbled, her breath catching in her throat at a sight that made every preconception dissolve like morning mist. The library was not what she expected, not a collection of leather-bound volumes purchased by the yard to impress visitors, but a working archive of maritime knowledge that spoke of genuine passion and decades of study. Original charts from Cook's voyages hung framed on walls of dark wood paneling. Ship models from every era of naval history occupied every surface from medieval cogs to modern frigates. Maritime instruments gleamed in glass cases. A full wall of naval histories arranged not alphabetically, but chronologically, showing a mind that thought in terms of evolution and progression. The scent of leather and beeswax filled the air. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny ships on invisible currents. And on the massive desk in the room's center lay charts spread and weighted at corners, with instruments Beatrice recognized as tools of serious navigation, not decorative antiques. She was still cataloguing details, her trained eye noting a globe that appeared actually accurate rather than decoratively approximate, when the Duke entered, and she turned to face a man who bore no resemblance whatsoever to her imaginings. Sebastian Fairfax was tall and dark-haired, with silver threading his temples in a way that suggested he was perhaps in his mid-30s, his brown eyes intelligent and assessing as they met hers with a directness that held no condescension, no mockery, no inappropriate interest, but rather the focused attention of someone evaluating a fellow professional. He was dressed simply for a duke, no excessive fobs or ornaments, his coat well-tailored but understated, clearly more comfortable in this library than he would be in a ballroom, and when he bowed, it was with the economy of movement that spoke of naval training rather than the elaborate flourishes of the ton. "Miss Wentworth," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "Thank you for making the journey to London. I hope your travels were not too arduous." She curtsied automatically, her defensive walls firmly in place, prepared to parry whatever came next. "Your Grace," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I confess myself curious about your letter and your very generous gift, though I am not certain I understand either." Sebastian gestured to the chairs near the window, an invitation rather than a command, and as Beatrice sat, she noticed he chose not the larger chair that would have emphasized his status, but the one opposite hers, creating an impression of equality that seemed deliberate. "Before we discuss business," he said, "I wonder if I might have your opinion on a technical matter that has been vexing me." He rose and retrieved a ship model from a nearby shelf, a sleek racing yacht with an unusual keel configuration. "I have been experimenting with deeper draft designs for improved windward performance, but I am concerned about the trade-off in maneuverability. What would be your assessment of this approach?" It was so unexpected, so genuinely interested rather than condescending, that Beatrice found herself leaning forward to examine the model before her suspicion could stop her. "The keel is too aggressive for coastal racing," she said slowly, her fingers tracing the lines without quite touching the delicate wood. "You would gain windward ability certainly, but lose tactical flexibility in tight courses with frequent tacks, and the deeper draft would limit your options in shallow water venues." She paused, then added with growing confidence, "If you reduced the keel depth by perhaps 2 inches, but increased the ballast concentration lower in the remaining depth, you might achieve a similar righting moment without sacrificing maneuverability." Sebastian's eyes lit with interest, and he leaned forward, his aristocratic reserve giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "That is precisely what my shipwright suggested, but I wanted a second opinion from someone with practical racing experience rather than merely theoretical knowledge. Tell me, how would you configure the sail plan to optimize such a design?" And suddenly they were deep in technical discussion, debating the merits of different sail configurations and rigging approaches, arguing respectfully about whether gaff or Bermuda rig provided better performance in varying conditions, exploring the mathematics of hull speed and the physics of wind interaction with canvas. Beatrice forgot to be nervous, forgot to guard her words, spoke with the passionate precision she had learned from her father and refined through years of study and practice. Sebastian challenged her ideas not dismissively, but thoughtfully, asking questions that revealed his own considerable knowledge, smiling slightly when she caught him in an error of calculation or offered an insight he had not considered. The conversation ranged across topics from navigation techniques to the proper maintenance of teak decks, and Beatrice discovered with something like wonder that she was enjoying herself, that this duke spoke her language not haltingly like a tourist attempting a foreign tongue, but fluently like a native speaker. An hour passed before Sebastian finally steered the conversation back to the reason for her visit. and Beatrice realized she had been so absorbed she had forgotten to maintain her suspicion. "Miss Wentworth," he said, his tone becoming more formal, though no less respectful. "I should explain why I asked you here. I witnessed your sailing at the Isle of Wight. That final tack was brilliant. You understood wind shear in a way Tilney never could. It was the finest piece of sailing I have seen in 20 years of watching regattas." The compliment, delivered without flattery or exaggeration, made Beatrice's throat tight. "Then why did you not speak in my defense?" "Your Grace," she asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "You were there in the royal pavilion. Your word might have carried weight." Sebastian met her eyes steadily, no flinching from the accusation implicit in her question. "Would it have?" he asked quietly. "Against centuries of prejudice and the Earl's wounded pride?" "I think not. I considered intervening and concluded that it would achieve nothing except perhaps making your position worse by suggesting you required a man's protection to validate your accomplishment. But I can offer something more useful than words. I can offer opportunity." Beatrice felt her defenses rising again, the familiar wariness returning. "Forgive my bluntness," she said, "but men do not typically offer women substantial employment without certain expectations." Sebastian's expression did not change, no offense taken, no surprise at her directness. "My expectation, Miss Wentworth," he said, his voice firm and clear, "is that you will revolutionize English sailing, nothing more and nothing less." The sincerity in his voice was almost painful to hear, so different from the careful manipulation she had learned to expect from men of his class. "Why?" she demanded, her frustration bleeding through her careful control. "Why does a duke care about maritime competitions or women's capabilities?" Sebastian was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window where the sounds of London filtered through, carriages and street vendors, and the distant calls of merchants, the city going about its business, indifferent to the conversation happening in this library. "Because I was at Trafalgar, Miss Wentworth," he said finally. "I saw what happens when talent is utilized regardless of convention. Admiral Collingwood promoted men based on skill, not birth. We won that battle because the best sailors were in the right positions. England is full of wasted talent. Women with brilliant minds confined to parlours, lower-class men denied education. It is not just unjust, it is strategically foolish." He turned back to face her, his brown eyes serious. "I want to sponsor a series of private races and maritime competitions, open to skilled sailors regardless of gender, with substantial prizes. I need someone to design the courses, judge the competitions, captain demonstration voyages. I am offering you not charity, but employment as my maritime consultant and captain of my racing fleet." The salary he named made Beatrice's heart stutter. It was more than her father had earned in his best years, enough to ensure his comfort and medical care, enough to restore some dignity to their reduced circumstances. "There is one condition," Sebastian continued. "You must stay in London for the season. Be seen in society with my sponsorship. Help me challenge the establishment's views on women's capabilities. Your visibility will be as important as your technical contributions." Beatrice stared at him, torn between pride that wanted to refuse anything resembling charity, practicality that desperately needed the money for her father's care, and an unexpected hope that this could vindicate not just her but every woman told her ambitions were inappropriate. She watched Sebastian carefully for signs of mockery or inappropriate attraction, found neither in his steady gaze, only respect and determination, and something that might have been understanding. The contrast between this masculine intellectual space and the frivolous drawing rooms she associated with aristocracy could not have been more stark. Here was a man who had built a sanctuary for serious thought rather than social performance, and he was offering to share it with her not as a curiosity, but as a colleague. "Your Grace," she said slowly, "I accept your offer, but I must be clear that I will not compromise my principles or my person for any salary however generous. Sebastian smiled then, a full, genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "Miss Wentworth," he said, "I would not respect you half so much if you were willing to compromise either. We have an agreement then. Welcome to the Thornbury Maritime Challenge." And Beatrice felt something unfurl in her chest, fragile and cautious, but unmistakably hope. The possibility that perhaps her life was not the closed circle of diminishing options she had believed, but rather a harbour from which new voyages might yet depart. Over the next 6 weeks, Beatrice became a fixture at the Thornbury shipyards and docks, working alongside Sebastian to prepare for the inaugural Thornbury Maritime Challenge, and she discovered that she possessed 2 entirely separate existences that felt like living 2 different lives in the same body. By day she was Captain Wentworth, respected and consulted, designing racing courses that would test skill rather than mere speed. Inspecting vessels with the critical eye of someone who understood that lives depended on sound construction, conducting trial sails on the Meridian that attracted curious crowds who gathered on the docks to watch a woman command a crew with the casual authority of long practice. The shipyards smelled of fresh timber and tar, the sailmakers' lofts were filled with canvas in every stage of construction, and the River Thames flowed past, carrying traffic that ranged from coal barges to pleasure craft, the great artery of London's commerce, indifferent to the small revolution happening on its banks. Sebastian worked beside her during these days, not above her or separate from her, but truly alongside, his jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up as he helped measure courses or consulted with shipwrights. And Beatrice found herself relaxing into a partnership that felt natural in a way nothing in her life had felt natural before. But by night, she became someone else entirely. That regatta woman whispered about at balls and dinners, paraded through glittering ballrooms in borrowed silk while aristocrats stared and speculated and passed judgment. Sebastian insisted she appear with him at select social events to build support among progressive aristocrats, and to make her presence normal. And Beatrice understood the strategy even as she hated the execution, each evening an exhausting performance where she must be decorative but not frivolous, knowledgeable but not threatening, accomplished but not arrogant, navigating social currents more treacherous than any she had faced on the water. The Whitmore Ball was particularly opulent, crystal chandeliers casting light that fractured into rainbows, an orchestra playing waltzes that made conversation difficult, hundreds of candles in silver sconces making the air thick and warm, silk and jewels everywhere in a display of wealth that made Beatrice acutely aware of her borrowed finery and provincial origins. Lord Edmund Tilney had begun a calculated campaign to undermine the Thornbury Challenge, spreading rumours that it was an expensive folly to indulge the Duke's eccentric mistress, lobbying to have the events banned from using established maritime venues, and his opposition seemed partly about masculine pride, but also about something more desperate. Whispers suggested he had gambling debts and needed the prize money from regattas he could no longer dominate if women were allowed to compete. During these weeks, Beatrice and Sebastian spent long hours together that extended beyond their professional collaboration, sailing at dawn when the Thames was quiet and the city still sleeping, discussing strategy over dinner at Thornbury House after exhausting days when neither had energy for social performance, their conversations ranging far beyond maritime matters to philosophy and politics and literature. Beatrice discovered that Sebastian read extensively and eclectically, supporting reform causes from abolition of slavery to workers' rights to expanded educational access, and he possessed a dry wit that surprised her into genuine laughter when she least expected it, making observations about the tone's absurdities that were all the funnier for being delivered in his serious manner. Sebastian discovered Beatrice's hidden vulnerabilities beneath her capable exterior, the loneliness that had marked her entire adult life, the grief over her father's declining health that she carried like a weight she could never set down, the deep-seated belief that she would never be truly accepted no matter how skilled she proved herself. She began to trust him in ways that terrified her, began to look forward to their time together with an anticipation that felt dangerous. But she guarded her heart carefully, because she remained convinced he saw her as an interesting project rather than as a woman, his respect professional rather than personal, his kindness the sort one might show to a promising student or a useful colleague. Sebastian struggled with feelings he had not anticipated and did not know how to express. His attraction to Beatrice's mind deepening into something more complicated and more consuming. But he maintained aristocratic reserve because he feared frightening her away, feared that any hint of romantic interest would make her question whether his professional respect was genuine or merely elaborate seduction. The tension between them grew like a storm building on a clear horizon, invisible to outsiders but palpable to anyone paying attention, and it reached breaking point at the Whitmore ball when Lord Tilney made his move. The Duchess of Whitmore was Sebastian's aunt, a formidable society matron who supported his project with the combination of genuine progressive belief and aristocratic pleasure in scandalizing her peers, and her ball was attended by everyone who mattered in London society, making it the perfect stage for confrontation. Beatrice stood near the refreshment table, trying to look comfortable in a gown of deep blue silk that Sebastian had insisted on providing, when Lord Tilney approached with a smile that did not reach his eyes and a voice pitched to carry to the surrounding guests. "Miss Wentworth," he said with false courtesy, "I have been hearing such remarkable things about your continued sailing activities, quite unprecedented for a lady." Beatrice felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward them, felt the weight of expectation and judgment, and she kept her voice level and dismissive. "Lord Tilney, I need prove nothing to you. Your ego is not my responsibility." His smile sharpened into something more predatory. "Afraid you cannot replicate your singular victory, Miss Wentworth?" he asked, his tone suggesting the answer was obvious. "If you truly have skill, let us race again, properly sanctioned this time with male crews to remove any advantage your lighter frame might have provided." The implication was clear and insulting, that her victory had been due to the vessel's weight distribution rather than her ability. And Beatrice felt rage flood through her hot and clarifying. Before she could respond, before she could tell Tilney exactly what she thought of his insinuations and his masculine insecurity, Sebastian's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Gentlemen and ladies," he said with the authority of a duke accustomed to being heard, "I propose we test Lord Tilney's hypothesis under controlled conditions." He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Beatrice in a gesture she recognized immediately as protective, and which made her teeth clench with frustration. "Lord Tilney, I accept on Miss Wentworth's behalf, but with modified terms. You will both sail identical vessels from my fleet with crews of your own choosing. The course will be designed by neutral parties, and the stakes. If Miss Wentworth wins, you will publicly acknowledge her skill and cease your opposition to the Thornbury challenge. If you win, I will dissolve the challenge, and Miss Wentworth will retire from sailing entirely." The crowd gasped at the audacity of the wager, at the stakes that seemed impossibly high, and Beatrice stood frozen in shock and mounting fury as Tilney accepted with obvious satisfaction, and the surrounding aristocrats began talking excitedly about this newest scandal. She waited until Sebastian turned to her with an expression of satisfaction, clearly expecting gratitude or at least agreement, and she met his eyes with a look that made him falter. "The garden?" she said quietly, her voice dangerously controlled. "Now." She turned and walked toward the terrace doors without waiting to see if he followed, knowing he would, needing the privacy to say what she needed to say without an audience of gleeful gossips. The Whitmore garden was moonlit and fragrant with roses, the scent of flowers mixing with the faint river smell that pervaded all of London, and the distant sound of music and laughter from the ballroom made their isolation feel both private and precarious. "How dare you?" Beatrice said the moment they were alone, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you wager my entire future without consulting me? Am I your employee or your possession, your grace?" Sebastian looked genuinely surprised by her anger, his expression shifting to defensive frustration. "I was defending your honor," he said, as though this explained everything. Beatrice stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that the intimacy of their proximity felt almost violent. "I do not need you to defend me," she said fiercely. "I need you to trust me. You claim to value my judgment in maritime matters, yet you make decisions about my life as if I am a child or a fool. But Beatrice, the man was insulting you publicly." Sebastian protested, his own frustration bleeding through his usual control. "What would you have had me do? Stand aside?" "Yes," she said, the word sharp as a blade. "Or ask me what I wanted. You are no different from my father or any other man. You claim to see me as capable, but when it matters, you still treat me as someone to be protected rather than consulted." The accusation hung between them in the moonlit garden, and Sebastian flinched as though she had struck him, his face going still with the expression of someone recognizing an uncomfortable truth. They stood close enough to speak quietly but intensely, close enough that Beatrice could see the conflict in his brown eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he processed her words. "You are right," he said finally, his voice quiet and stripped of defensiveness. "I apologize. I have become so accustomed to—" He paused, searching for words, "to caring about your well-being that I forgot to respect your autonomy. It will not happen again." The admission surprised Beatrice almost as much as his original presumption had angered her, and she felt some of her fury drain away, leaving behind exhaustion and a dangerous vulnerability. "Why do you care?" she asked, hearing the question beneath the question, needing to understand whether his care was professional or something else entirely. Sebastian met her eyes steadily, and in the moonlight his face was unguarded in a way it never was in ballrooms, or even in the privacy of his library. "Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said simply. "Because watching you sail is like watching someone speak a language I have spent my whole life trying to learn fluently. Because your mind challenges mine in ways I did not know I needed. Because the thought of you being diminished or silenced makes me want to tear down every structure that would attempt it." He stopped, seeming to realize he had said more than he intended, and Beatrice felt her heart hammering against her ribs with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. "But that does not give me the right to make your choices for you," Sebastian continued, his voice firmer now. "You are correct. I treated you as someone to be protected rather than as the capable professional you are, and I am sorry." Beatrice wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to her fury as protection against the feelings his words were stirring in her chest, but she found herself softening despite her best efforts. "I will race Tilney," she said quietly. "Not because you accepted the challenge, but because I choose to, because he needs to be answered, and because other women need to see that we can win even when the odds are deliberately stacked against us." Sebastian nodded, respect and something else warming his expression. "Then we will prepare together," he said, "as partners, with you making the final decisions about strategy and approach." They stood in the moonlit garden with the scent of roses around them and the distant music floating on the night air, and Beatrice realized that something had shifted between them, that the argument had paradoxically brought them closer by forcing honesty neither had been willing to risk before. The intimacy of their anger had cracked open something neither had acknowledged, and as they returned to the ballroom side by side, Beatrice felt the foundation of their partnership transforming into something deeper and more dangerous and infinitely more precious than mere professional respect. The race between Beatrice and Lord Tilney was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving both time to prepare, and it would take place on the Thames estuary, a notoriously tricky course with shifting currents and unpredictable winds where local knowledge mattered as much as skill. Both would sail identical 30-foot sloops from Sebastian's fleet, leveling any advantage of equipment, and the event had captured public imagination in a way that surprised everyone. Newspapers covering it daily with speculation and commentary, bets placed in clubs and taverns across London, crowds planning to line the shores to witness what the papers were calling the race of the century. Beatrice threw herself into preparation with near-obsessive focus, studying charts of the estuary until she could navigate it blind, practicing maneuvers until her hands bled and her muscles screamed, pushing herself and her temporary crew through drills that left them exhausted but perfectly coordinated. Sebastian offered to help, offered his own considerable knowledge and experience, but she refused with a stubbornness that bordered on self-destruction because she needed to prove to herself, not just to society, that she could do this alone, that her victory would be entirely her own, with no suggestion that a man's guidance had made it possible. The night before the race, when Beatrice should have been resting, an urgent letter arrived from Portsmouth, Mrs. Gardiner's careful handwriting delivering news that made Beatrice's world contract to a single point of agonizing choice. Captain Wentworth's health had worsened dramatically. The doctor feared he had only weeks left, perhaps only days, and he was asking for his daughter with the desperate need of a man who understood his time was measured in hours rather than months. Beatrice stood in her small rented rooms, holding the letter with hands that shook, facing a decision that felt like choosing between her past and her future, between honoring her father and vindicating every woman who had been told her dreams were impossible. If she forfeited the race to return to Portsmouth, she would be with her father when he died, would hold his hand and ease his passage, but she would also betray everyone who had believed in her, including her father himself, who had raised her to be brave and capable, and who would be devastated to know she had sacrificed her victory for his sake. If she raced and won, but her father died while she was on the water, she would carry that guilt for the rest of her life, would wonder if those final moments of his life had been spent feeling abandoned by the daughter he had loved enough to teach her to sail. She went to Thornbury House late at night, admitted by a surprised butler who recognized the urgency in her face, and she found Sebastian in his library exactly where she had known he would be, surrounded by charts of the racecourse that he had been studying despite her refusal of his help, unable to stop himself from wanting to give her every possible advantage. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted immediately from concentration to concern, rising from his desk as she crossed the room with steps that felt unsteady. "I must withdraw from the race," she said without preamble, her voice brittle with control that was fracturing with every word. "My father is dying and I need to be with him. I cannot sail tomorrow." Sebastian moved toward her, and she held up a hand to stop him because if he touched her she would shatter completely. "If I race and he dies while I am on the water, I will never forgive myself," she continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "But if I forfeit, I betray everyone who has believed in me, including him. He raised me to be strong and capable, and now I must choose between being the daughter he needs and being the woman he taught me to be." The tears came then, the accumulated stress and grief overwhelming defenses she had maintained for weeks, and she found herself sobbing with a rawness that terrified her, all her careful control dissolving into pure anguish. Sebastian crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, not asking permission, simply holding her while she broke apart against his chest, his hand steady in her hair, while she cried with the desperation of someone who had held on too long and too tightly. "Then let me tell you what I should have said weeks ago," Sebastian said quietly when her sobs had subsided to ragged breathing. "I love you, Beatrice, not the idea of you, not your skill or your defiance of convention, but you, your stubbornness and your grief and your impossible standards for yourself. I bought those ships because I could not bear the thought of the world silencing you." Beatrice pulled back enough to look at his face, searching for mockery or pity, finding neither, only an honesty that made her heart stutter. "You love me," she repeated, the words sounding impossible. "But I am not. I am not what a duke should want." "You are exactly what this duke wants," Sebastian said, his brown eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. The question is whether you could want a man foolish enough to wager your future without asking, arrogant enough to think he could protect you from the world's cruelty. "I could want him," Beatrice whispered, feeling something crack open in her chest. "I do want him. God help me, Sebastian. I love you." He kissed her then, with all the pent-up longing of months of restraint, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contradicted the desperation in his mouth. And Beatrice kissed him back with equal hunger, months of carefully maintained distance dissolving in the heat of finally acknowledged desire. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Sebastian kept his forehead pressed to hers and spoke with quiet certainty. "Your father would be devastated if you forfeited for his sake," he said. "He raised you to be extraordinary, and he wants to see you vindicated. I will personally ensure he receives the best medical care, and if he is well enough, I will bring him to London to witness your victory. Race tomorrow, Beatrice. Win for him and for yourself, and for every woman who will come after you. And know that whether you win or lose, I will love you exactly the same." The race day arrived with weather so perfect it felt like providence, clear skies and steady wind, the kind of conditions that rewarded skill rather than luck. And thousands lined the shores of the Thames estuary in a display that rivaled royal occasions. Beatrice and Tilney began evenly matched, both sailing identical sloops with crews they had trained personally, and for the first half of the course they traded positions with the kind of tactical sailing that had the watching experts murmuring appreciation. By the halfway point, Beatrice's superior understanding of estuary currents gave her an advantage. She knew where the water ran fastest and where eddies would slow progress. And she used this knowledge to gain 2 boat lengths on Tilney, who sailed the technically correct line but lacked her intimate familiarity with these particular waters. Then disaster struck with the sharp crack of tearing canvas, her mainsail ripping during a crucial tack, a defect in the fabric that no inspection could have predicted, and suddenly Tilney was pulling ahead while Beatrice's boat wallowed with reduced power. Sebastian watched from a viewing vessel anchored near the course, unable to hide his anxiety despite the company of a dozen aristocrats who had come to witness the spectacle, and when her sail tore, he physically flinched as though feeling the damage in his own body. Beatrice had seconds to decide, retire with honor, and lose everything the challenge represented, or attempt a dangerous repair while underway that could capsize her if she made a single error in the tricky estuary currents. "For Papa," she whispered to herself, as her hands moved with practiced efficiency. For every woman told she could not. For myself, hold together, damn you. In a display of seamanship that stunned the watching crowd into awed silence, she partially lowered the damaged sail while her crew managed the reduced canvas. Then she executed an emergency splice while managing the tiller with her feet in a feat of balance and coordination that should have been impossible, her hands bleeding as rough rope abraded skin already raw from weeks of practice. She hoisted a reduced sail configuration that was unorthodox but functional, a combination of techniques from different sailing traditions that no one watching had seen before, and she lost time, but she did not lose the race. Sebastian watched her repair with pride and love written across his face so clearly that several of his companions exchanged knowing glances, and he did not cheer or call encouragement because he understood she needed to do this alone, needed the victory to be entirely hers. In the final stretch, Beatrice used an aggressive inside line that risked running aground on a sandbar that appeared only at certain tides, a gamble that required precise knowledge of water depth and current speed and absolute faith in her calculations. Tilney saw her intention and tried to match her line, but hesitated at the crucial moment, his nerve failing when he saw how shallow the water ran, and that hesitation cost him the race. Beatrice crossed the finish line 3 boat lengths ahead, with her jury-rigged sail still holding, and the crowd's roar was deafening, a wall of sound that crashed over the estuary like a physical force, thousands of voices raised in appreciation of skill that transcended gender or social convention. She sat alone in her boat for a moment after crossing, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion, and a completeness that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with having chosen the hard right thing over the easy wrong thing, having trusted herself and her father's faith in her, even when doubt screamed that she should retreat to safety. Lord Tilney sailed his boat alongside hers, and his handsome face was serious but no longer hostile, his conventional good looks somehow diminished by genuine respect. "Miss Wentworth," he called across the water, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby spectator boats. "You have bested me twice, once with skill and once with courage. I was a fool to oppose you." The public acknowledgment was gracious and began his own redemption, revealing his earlier opposition as insecurity rather than malice, and Beatrice felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. The finish line chaos gave way to an eerie quiet as officials conferred and spectators waited, and then Sebastian's viewing vessel drew close, and he was there looking at her with eyes that held everything he had confessed the night before, not cheering or congratulating, but simply present, waiting because he knew the first person she would want to see. Beatrice climbed aboard his vessel with hands that were steady despite everything, and Sebastian pulled her into his arms in full view of London society, kissing her with a thoroughness that made several matrons gasp and started a whole new round of gossip. But neither of them cared, because the race had delivered on the title's promise and the emotional climax of the night before had already transformed everything between them. "Your father is here," Sebastian murmured against her hair. "I brought him this morning. He wanted to see you win." And Beatrice turned to find Captain Wentworth wrapped in blankets on the viewing deck, his face gaunt but his eyes bright with pride, and she went to him and knelt beside his chair while he placed a shaking hand on her head in blessing, and she knew that whatever time remained to them would be enough because he had seen her vindicated, had witnessed the world acknowledge what he had always known, that his daughter was extraordinary, and that her gender had never been a limitation except in the minds of small men who feared her competence. Beatrice's victory transformed her from scandal to sensation overnight, newspapers running headlines that proclaimed the captain conquers and Miss Wentworth's triumph, editorial pages that had mocked her weeks before now celebrating her as evidence of English ingenuity and determination. But more significantly than the fickle approval of the press, her demonstration of skill under pressure changed minds in ways that mattered. Women from across England writing letters asking about the Thornbury Maritime Challenge, seeking advice on how they might develop their own sailing skills, telling stories of dreams deferred and ambitions suppressed. Progressive members of Parliament cited her victory in debates about expanding women's educational opportunities, using her emergency sail repair as metaphor for the resourcefulness that would flourish if given proper training and support, and even conservative voices found it difficult to argue against the evidence that competence transcended gender when thousands had witnessed it with their own eyes. A week after the race, the Royal Yacht Club held an emergency meeting to reconsider its policies, and Lord Tilney, honouring his word, spoke in favour of allowing women to compete in sanctioned events, his testimony carrying weight precisely because he had opposed her so vigorously and been proven wrong so publicly. The measure passed narrowly, with votes breaking along generational lines, older members clinging to tradition, while younger sailors recognized that excluding half the population from competition only weakened English maritime excellence. Sebastian used his considerable influence to ensure the Regatta Committee issued a formal apology to Beatrice, and posthumously credited her with the Isle of Wight victory, Tilney's win stricken from the record books and replaced with her name, a correction that felt less like vindication than simple acknowledgement of truth. Meanwhile, Captain Wentworth had been brought to London, where Sebastian's personal physicians tended him with a care and expertise that Beatrice could never have afforded, and his health had stabilized, though he remained weak, his body too damaged by consumption to fully recover, but his mind sharp, and his spirits lifted by witnessing his daughter's triumph. Beatrice divided her time between her father's bedside in the comfortable rooms Sebastian had arranged at Thornbury House and planning the inaugural Thornbury Challenge now scheduled for autumn, and she discovered that success brought its own complications, that being celebrated rather than scorned required different navigation, but was no less exhausting. Sebastian knew he should propose formally, knew that every day he delayed risked losing her to some other man who would recognize her value, but he found himself paralyzed by a terror he had not anticipated and did not know how to overcome. Beatrice had her independence now. The challenge would provide substantial income. She had her ships registered in her own name. Society had accepted her capabilities in ways that meant she would never lack for opportunities or respect. And what could he offer that she could not achieve alone? What reason could he give for why she should bind herself to him beyond gratitude for support she no longer needed? He began to withdraw slightly, trying to give her space to choose her future freely, not wanting to pressure her with his title or his wealth or the debt she might feel she owed him. And Beatrice, watching this withdrawal, felt her heart crack with the certainty that his interest had been in the project, not the woman, that now that she was successfully launched into society, he was retreating to find new causes to champion. The confrontation came at the Thornbury Challenge launch celebration, a garden party at Thornbury House that was elegant but relaxed. The grounds decorated with maritime touches like rope arranged in decorative knots, compass roses painted on silk bunting, model ships as centerpieces on tables laden with refreshments. The afternoon sunshine was golden and warm, the Thames visible in the distance carrying its usual traffic, and the guests were a carefully curated mixture of maritime enthusiasts and reformers and progressive aristocrats, people who had supported the challenge or been converted by Beatrice's victory. Beatrice wore a new gown of deep blue silk that was simple but elegant, Sebastian's gift that she had almost refused before realizing that accepting it was not surrender but partnership, and she moved through the crowds with a confidence that would have been impossible months before, finally comfortable in her dual identity as sailor and lady. She overheard the conversation by accident, turning a corner in the garden path to find Sebastian speaking with his aunt, the Duchess of Whitmore, in tones too quiet for general hearing, but clear enough for Beatrice hidden behind a hedge of roses. Sebastian. You must propose before the girl thinks you have lost interest, the Duchess was saying, with the exasperation of a woman watching someone sabotage his own happiness. She will have suitors now. You saw Lord Morland's attention at dinner last week. If you wait much longer, some other man will recognize Miss Wentworth's value. She deserves to choose her own path, aunt. Sebastian replied, his voice heavy with something that sounded like resignation. I will not trap her with obligation or gratitude disguised as affection. She has spent her entire life being told what she must do and must be. I will not add my own requirements to that burden. Beatrice felt understanding crash over her like a wave, the sudden clarity that his withdrawal had been respect, not rejection, that he was giving her the freedom to choose rather than assuming she would want what he wanted to offer. She waited until the Duchess had departed with a sound of aristocratic frustration. Then she found Sebastian alone in his library, which had become their emotional sanctuary, the place where they had first connected and first fought and first confessed love. The early evening light slanted through tall windows, the fireplace was lit against autumn chill, and the familiar scent of leather and beeswax wrapped around her like an embrace as she closed the door firmly behind her. If you love me, she said without preamble, why will you not ask me to stay? Sebastian turned from the window where he had been staring at the Thames, his face carefully neutral in the way she had learned meant he was hiding strong emotion. Because I want you to choose freely, he said quietly. Because you have options now and opportunities, because I will not use your gratitude or your practical need for security to bind you to a life you might not want. Beatrice crossed the room to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he had to look at her, close enough that he could not hide behind aristocratic reserve. "You are a fool, Sebastian Fairfax," she said, but her tone was gentle rather than angry. "You think I want freedom from you when what I want is freedom with you. You think you are trapping me when you are the only person who has ever made me feel truly free." "I do not understand," Sebastian said, confusion breaking through his control. Beatrice took a deep breath, and then she did something that would have been unthinkable months before. She dropped to one knee on the library floor in a gesture that inverted every convention she had been raised to honor. "Sebastian Fairfax, you infuriating man," she said, looking up at him with eyes that held no doubt. "You gave me ships, but that is not why I love you. You defended my honor, but that is not why I love you. You believe in my capabilities, but that is not even why I love you." "Then why?" Sebastian asked, his voice rough with emotion he was no longer trying to hide. "Because you are the only person who has ever made me feel that being myself, stubborn and unconventional and obsessed with tides and wind patterns, is not just acceptable, but desirable," she said. "Because when I am with you, I am not performing or proving anything. I am simply enough, because I would rather sail the world with you than achieve every maritime victory alone. Will you marry me?" A footman chose that moment to enter with a tray of drinks, froze in scandalized shock at the sight of a woman proposing to a duke, and retreated so quickly he nearly dropped the entire service. But neither Beatrice nor Sebastian noticed, because Sebastian had pulled her up from her knee and was holding her face in his hands with a tenderness that made her throat tight. "Beatrice, you have been more than enough since the moment you crossed that finish line at the Isle of Wight," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Yes, I will marry you. I want nothing more than to spend my life sailing beside you and arguing about keel design and watching you terrify small-minded men with your competence." His acceptance was immediate and emotional, and when he kissed her it was with the desperation of someone who had been preparing to lose something precious, and discovered instead that it was choosing him, that he was wanted not for his title or his wealth, but for himself. They married quietly 3 weeks later in a small chapel chosen for its intimacy, rather than its grandeur, late summer flowers filling the space with fragrance, and Captain Wentworth walked Beatrice down the aisle with steps that were slow but steady, his pride in her marriage clearly about Sebastian's character, not his title. "I taught you to sail, my dear," he whispered to her before giving her hand to Sebastian. "But you have navigated to a harbor I never could have charted. Be happy." It was his last public appearance, his final gift to his daughter, the sight of her settled and loved and vindicated. And when he died 2 months later, Beatrice grieved deeply, but without regret, because he had seen her triumph and approved her choice, and departed, knowing she would be cared for not as a dependent, but as a partner. The ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by the people who had supported them through scandal and opposition, reformed Lord Tilney, who had become an unexpected ally, the progressive aristocrats who had championed the challenge, the sailors who had crewed Beatrice's vessels and learned that a woman's commands were as worthy of respect as any man's, and Sebastian's delighted aunt, who took credit for the entire romance, despite having nearly sabotaged it with her meddling. Beatrice stood beside Sebastian and made her vows with a certainty she had never felt about anything except sailing. And when the vicar pronounced them married, she felt not the loss of independence she had always feared, but rather the gaining of a partner who would sail beside her through whatever waters lay ahead, calm or stormy, charted or unknown. 18 months after their wedding, Beatrice stood at the helm of the Meridian with the wind in her face, and her husband working the sails under her direction, the vessel now refitted as a combination racing yacht and research vessel that reflected their shared passions and complementary skills. She was clearly pregnant, about 6 months along, her belly round beneath the practical sailing dress she had commissioned specifically for this purpose. And Sebastian had finally stopped asking if she should be resting instead of conducting trials for the new keel design she had invented and would be presenting to the Royal Naval Academy the following week. The Thornbury Maritime Challenge had become an annual institution that attracted sailors from across England and even from the continent, and 3 women had competed in the most recent Royal Regatta, with 2 finishing in the top 10, a statistic that made Beatrice smile every time she thought of it, because it meant the world was changing in small but measurable ways. They sailed into Portsmouth harbour on a morning that sparkled with possibility, the water glittering in sunshine that turned the sails golden. And waiting on the dock were the young women participating in the Wentworth Scholarship Programme, a fund Sebastian had established in Captain Wentworth's memory to provide maritime education to talented girls, regardless of their families' finances. The students were diverse in age and background, some barely 14 and others nearly 20. Some from merchant families and others from working-class households that had scraped together every penny to support their daughters' unusual ambitions, and all of them looked at Beatrice with expressions that mixed awe and hope and determination. She addressed them on the dock with the smell of salt and tar around them and the sound of rigging singing in the wind, telling them her story without softening the difficult parts, the humiliation at the Isle of Wight and the years of being told she was too much, too skilled and too unconventional and too bold for any proper woman. 3 years ago I was told that my greatest victory was invalid because of my gender, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. Today I am consulting with the Royal Navy on ship design. What changed, not the world's willingness to accept me, that came slowly and is still incomplete. What changed was my willingness to stop seeking permission to be excellent. A young student raised her hand tentatively, her face earnest beneath a cap that barely contained her dark curls. But what if we fail, miss? What if we are not strong enough or skilled enough? Beatrice smiled at the question, because she had asked it herself so many times, had lain awake nights cataloguing her inadequacies and imagining all the ways she might prove insufficient. Then you will fail and learn and try differently, she said gently. But you will do it having attempted something remarkable. I would rather be remembered as the woman who tried and failed than the woman who never tried at all. And besides, the difference between strong enough and not strong enough is usually just practice and determination and refusing to accept that your gender determines your capabilities. That evening at Thornbury House, Beatrice and Sebastian were in the library, because where else would they be? The room that had been his sanctuary now thoroughly theirs, with her charts mixed among his books and her instruments sharing shelf space with his maritime histories. Sebastian was editing her technical drawings for the Naval Academy presentation, his comments written in the margins with the precision of someone who understood both the theory and the practical application, while Beatrice read through correspondence that had accumulated during their sailing trip. Among the letters was one from Charlotte Tilney, Lord Edmund's younger sister, who wrote with barely contained excitement that she had just been accepted to the Royal Naval Academy's new and scandalously coeducational maritime engineering program, a development directly inspired by Beatrice's example and the changing attitudes her victory had helped catalyze. This angle on the keel, Sebastian said, looking up from the drawings. Have you tested it in heavy weather? Not yet, Beatrice replied, setting aside Charlotte's letter with a smile. I thought we would take the Meridian to Cornwall next month if the baby cooperates. Sebastian's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession, concern and exasperation and reluctant admiration. Beatrice, you will be 7 months pregnant, he said with the tone of someone who knew he was fighting a losing battle, and therefore perfectly capable of sailing. She countered, meeting his eyes with amusement. Sebastian, we have discussed this. I am pregnant, not invalid, and our child will benefit from experiencing the sea before birth. It will make them a natural sailor. Sebastian smiled despite himself, shaking his head in surrender. I know, he said. "I am working on accepting that our child's first voyage will be in utero, though I reserve the right to worry excessively and insist on extra safety precautions." Their conversation revealed the comfortable intimacy of equal partners who had learned each other's languages and rhythms over months of shared work and shared life. They debated the keel design technicalities with the ease of people who enjoyed intellectual sparring, Sebastian conceding to Beatrice's expertise when her arguments were sound and pushing back when he thought she was overlooking variables. And she asked his opinion on how to handle the Naval Academy's inevitable resistance to her proposals, knowing he understood the politics of institutional change in ways her direct nature sometimes missed. They discussed names for the baby, with both hoping for a daughter, though planning to teach the child to sail regardless of gender, arguing cheerfully about whether Eleanor or Josephine better honored their mothers while also sounding strong enough for a future sailor. The library had evolved to reflect their blended lives, a cradle in the corner being built by the estate carpenter from teak, salvaged from a ship that had served in Nelson's fleet, Beatrice's practical sailing clothes hanging beside Sebastian's formal coats in the wardrobe, the scent of beeswax and leather now mingled with the salt smell that clung to everything they owned. Later, when Sebastian had gone to consult with his steward about estate business, Beatrice sat at her desk and opened the journal she had kept since childhood, the pages chronicling her journey from hopeful girl to humiliated woman to vindicated sailor to contented wife. She wrote directly to her future child, her hand moving across the page with the confidence of someone who had finally learned that her story was worth telling. "To my child," she wrote, "your father gave me ships, but more importantly he gave me the freedom to captain them. He saw in me not a project to be improved or a problem to be solved, but a partner to be valued. May you find someone who offers you not a harbor from life's storms, but a compass to navigate them with confidence." She wrote about the journey from being told she was too much to finding someone who celebrated those very qualities, about learning that love was not about diminishing yourself to fit someone else's expectations, but about finding someone whose expectations expanded to embrace all of who you were. "May you always choose the helm over the harbor," she wrote, "the storm over the shelter, the life you want over the life you are told to accept. And may you know that every no you encounter is simply redirection toward a better, yes. Every closed door is simply the universe pushing you toward the door that was meant to open." Sebastian came to stand behind her chair, reading over her shoulder in the companionable way they had developed. And when she set down her pen, he kissed the top of her head with a tenderness that still made her heart catch after 18 months of marriage. Through the library window, the Thames was visible in the moonlight. Ships at anchor riding the gentle current, the water reflecting stars, and the promise of morning tides and new voyages yet to be undertaken. The city beyond was quiet at this late hour, London settling into sleep while Beatrice and Sebastian remained awake in their sanctuary, planning futures and solving problems, and existing in the comfortable silence of two people who had found in each other not completion because they were already complete, but rather companionship. The joy of sailing through life with someone who understood that the journey mattered more than the destination, and that the best adventures were the ones undertaken together. Beatrice leaned back against Sebastian's chest and felt their child move beneath her hand, a flutter of life that was both promise and responsibility. And she thought about all the young women in the Wentworth Scholarship Program who would sail because she had refused to stop sailing, all the girls who would believe their dreams were possible because she had made her impossible dreams real. The victory at the Thames estuary had been important, but this was the true triumph, the slow, patient work of changing minds and opening opportunities and creating pathways for others to follow, the understanding that her story mattered, not because it was unique, but because it could become less unique with every woman who dared to claim the helm. "Dear listener," the story whispered in the quiet of the library, Perhaps tonight you feel like Beatrice once did, told that your skills are inappropriate and your dreams too ambitious, and your very nature somehow wrong for the life you are meant to lead. The world still whispers that we must choose between being capable and being loved, between excellence and acceptance. But Beatrice's story reminds us that the right person does not ask you to diminish yourself. The right person does not love you despite your strengths, but because of them. Every talent you have been told to hide, and every passion you have been taught to suppress, and every time you have made yourself smaller to fit someone else's expectations. Those are not flaws to be corrected, but gifts waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize their value. Tonight, as you rest, know this: your unconventional dreams are not obstacles to love, but the very qualities that will draw the right person to you. The rejection you fear or have already experienced is not evidence of your inadequacy, but simply life redirecting you toward someone who can handle the full storm of who you are. Sleep peacefully knowing that somewhere your Sebastian is waiting, not to rescue you but to sail beside you. And when you meet, it will not be because you have changed or compromised who you are, but because you have finally found someone brave enough to love the captain you were always meant to be. May your dreams be filled with fair winds and following seas, and may you wake tomorrow with the courage to captain your own heart, with deepest admiration for your journey. This has been Legends of the Fall.